All right, ready to dive into the world of espionage. You know it's not all secret codes and gadgets, right? Sometimes it's as simple as pigeons.
Pigeons.
Yeah, apparently those birds we see in the park, they might actually be high-flying spies, especially in China.
Huh. It really is amazing how something so ordinary can be used for, well, spying. And you know what's even more interesting? A simple conversation about pigeons on a podcast, The Rest is History, actually led to a whole new podcast about espionage.
Really?
Yep, the rest is classified. It just goes to show how much hidden intrigue there is in this world.
It's true. Truth can be stranger than fiction. Speaking of which, have you heard about Mansfield Cumming, the first chief of MI6?
Oh, yeah, I know about him.
Well, let's just say he had a unique way of interviewing potential recruits.
Oh, absolutely.
Now,
Stabbing his wooden leg with a penknife. Talk about a test of composure. You definitely wouldn't see that at your average job interview.
Can you imagine? You'd think you walked into a spy movie by mistake. But speaking of movies, Anna Chapman's story sounds like one. A Russian agent just living a normal life in London and New York, all while gathering intel.
That's a great example of how espionage has evolved. She wasn't some deep cover agent with a fake identity. She was operating under what they call commercial cover, using her real name, blending right into society, much harder to detect.
It is kind of unsettling, this whole blending in thing. It's not like the old days with shadowy figures disappearing in the dark. Now it's all about hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. And that's a tactic that Russia seems to be using more and more these days.
I guess with all the technology now, like facial recognition stuff, it's harder to create fake identities.
Right. It's much easier to use people who can just naturally move between societies, without raising suspicion.
So if those traditional deep cover techniques are harder to pull off, how does that change things? How does that change espionage?
It forces everyone to adapt. Think about it every time you cross a border, buy something, even just post on social media, you leave a digital trail. It's almost impossible to erase. So for intelligence agencies, it's not so much about catching someone red-handed, with a microfilm or something. It's about analyzing all that data, looking for subtle patterns and anything unusual that might point to espionage.
Like finding a needle in a digital haystack.
Mhm.
But it's not just the methods that are changing, right? It's the impact, too.
Oh, for sure. Sometimes the consequences of espionage are immediate and dramatic, but a lot of times they're much more subtle. They play out over years, even decades.
Like Kim Philby, probably one of the most infamous double agents ever. His betrayal didn't lead to some big war or anything like that, but it had a huge impact on British intelligence. Just imagine the distrust, the paranoia that must have created, not to mention the damage to relationships with allies.
Exactly. It's like a crack in the foundation. It might not bring the whole house down right away, but it weakens the entire structure. That's why understanding the history of espionage is so important. It lets us see those long-term consequences. How actions taken in secret can actually shape the world we live in today.
So it's about learning from the past, so we don't make the same mistakes in the future.
Right.
But with all this talk about technology and new tactics, there's one thing we can't forget about: pigeons.
Ah, yes, those feathered messengers. Might seem like something from the past, but there are some serious concerns that Britain might be falling behind China in, well, what some are calling the pigeon gap.
The pigeon gap sounds kind of funny.
Right.
But seriously, is it possible that even in this age of satellites and drones, pigeons are still valuable for spies? Makes you wonder what other ordinary things today might actually be playing a much bigger role in global affairs than we realize.
It does make you think, doesn't it? Maybe we're too focused on the latest technology and overlooking the potential of simpler tools. Or maybe we're just not seeing the bigger picture, how all these seemingly unrelated pieces fit together.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a bit and dive deeper into Anna Chapman's story.
Yeah.
This new breed of spy that's blurring the lines between blending in and just disappearing completely.
Anna Chapman, her story really shows how espionage is changing, in the 21st century. The podcast hosts, they describe her as a particular type of spy, not the classic illegal like you see in those Cold War spy novels.
So not someone with a totally made-up identity, fake passport, the whole 9 yards.
Right. Chapman, she kept her real name, although I guess Chapman did help a bit to, hide her Russian background. And that's an important difference. She wasn't living under a totally made-up life, more like what they call commercial cover real identity, but her real employer, that's hidden.
So it's almost like she was hiding in plain sight. Must have made her pretty hard to catch.
Yeah, exactly. The podcast makes a good point. She's more comparable to, say, a CIA officer working undercover but not officially. They use their real identity, but their real employer is a secret. Maybe they pretend to be a businessman or a journalist or something, but they're really gathering intelligence.
So how did she get into espionage in the first place? Was it, like, always the plan?
Well, what's interesting is that the podcast suggests it was more of a gradual thing. The Russians, they say, are more flexible in how they approach things. It's
Yeah.
not so much about formally recruiting someone, but more about spotting potential and then developing it over time.
So they saw something in her back in London, maybe her ability to connect with people.
Seems like it. She was already moving between different groups, building relationships. And as we know, in the world of espionage, relationships are everything.
This organic step-by-step process. It sounds like, well, kind of like mentoring, but for spies.
Yeah, in a way. They talk about how it's different from Western intelligence agencies. They often have these strict categories and rules. You're either an asset or an officer, this type of operation or that. But the Russians, they seem more adaptable.
So they're more focused on results, less worried about labels. But wouldn't that make them more vulnerable to double agents? If all you care about is the information, you might not be as careful about who you trust.
That's a good point. There's definitely a trade-off there. Focusing only on results, well, sometimes you might sacrifice thoroughness and security. But with Chapman, it seems like they were willing to take that risk.
So she's moving in these circles, building relationships. But when do they actually start using her for espionage? Was there a specific moment where she was recruited, or was it more subtle?
The podcast, they suggest it's more like training her up as you go. She already had access and influence, so it was about helping her sharpen those skills for gathering intelligence. Maybe teaching her how to spot valuable information, how to get it without being suspicious, how to communicate securely.
So like an apprenticeship, but with much higher stakes.
Haha, yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the podcast actually compares it to how Russia traditionally used illegals. Those spies who basically create a whole new identity to blend into Western societies, like in that show The Americans, where they take the identities of dead people and build these elaborate cover stories.
But with all the technology we have now, like biometrics and facial recognition, wouldn't those kinds of deep cover operations be almost impossible to pull off?
Yeah, you're right. It's getting really hard to keep up that level of deception with all the digital stuff. And Russia's figured that out. They realize that they don't always have to go to such extreme lengths. They already have people like Anna Chapman who can easily move between societies without raising any red flags. They already blend in.
It's more of a take what you can get approach. And probably a lot cheaper, too. Why spend all that time and money training someone to be a fake Canadian when you can use someone who's already integrated?
Right, exactly. That's what makes this change in Russian espionage so interesting. It seems like they're adapting to how the world is changing. Globalization, technology, all of it.
It's like a game of chess. You have to constantly think ahead, predict your opponent's moves, and adjust your strategy. In this case, technology is changing the game.
Definitely. Espionage, just like anything else, has to evolve to stay ahead.
So we've got this new breed of spy blending in, collecting information. But how are they actually doing it? What kind of information are they after? Is it like top secret nuclear codes or something? Or is it more subtle than that?
The rest is classified. They dig into that a bit more. They focus on what Chapman was doing in the U.S. Remember, this was around 2010. Things were pretty tense between Russia and the West.
Right. The Cold War was over, but there was still a lot of mistrust and suspicion. So what was she up to? Trying to, I don't know, infiltrate the Pentagon or something?
No, nothing quite that dramatic. It seems like her targets were more low-key, but still important. Building relationships with influential people, getting access to powerful circles. Politicians, business leaders, scientists, anyone who might have valuable information or could sway decision-making.
So classic spy stuff, but with a modern twist. Instead of sneaking into top-secret buildings, she's going to cocktail parties and networking events.
Exactly. The podcast describes it as swimming in the waters, hopefully unseen. She's not trying to stand out. She's blending in, becoming part of these elite social circles.
It's a much more subtle and, well, kind of sneaky form of espionage, isn't it? You wouldn't even know you were being targeted.
Yeah.
You might think you're just chatting with someone you met, but they're actually getting valuable information from you.
And that's what makes it so effective. It's a slow drip of information. Maybe each piece seems harmless on its own, but when you put it all together, it can tell you a lot.
Like a mosaic, right? Each little piece might not look like much, but when they're all put together, they create a bigger picture. But that raises a big question. How do you even fight this kind of espionage when the lines are so blurry? It's not like she was carrying around secret codes or leaving messages in dead drops.
Yeah, that's the tough question. It requires a different way of thinking. We can't rely on the old counterintelligence methods anymore, like just wiretaps and cameras.
I guess we need a whole new generation of intelligence analysts. People who can read people as well as they can crack codes. People who can spot those tiny inconsistencies, those little things that might be a sign of something bigger.
You got it. We need people who can connect the dots, see the bigger picture, and anticipate threats before they happen. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but the needle looks just like a piece of hay.
This kind of espionage is like a chameleon blending in so well that it's really hard to see. Which brings us back to that unsettling question. What else is out there, hiding in plain sight that we're totally missing?
It's a scary thought, isn't it? That something that seems totally harmless could actually be part of some bigger hidden agenda.
It's a very different picture of espionage than what we're used to from all those Cold War spy stories. It's not so much about gadgets and secret missions anymore. It's more about understanding human behavior, how people interact, and how information flows in our super connected world.
You're right. And it reminds us that it can be really hard to tell what's real and what's fake, especially when it comes to national security.
That's a pretty sobering thought. But before we get too deep into that, let's go back to something we talked about earlier.
The pigeons. You mean the pigeons.
Yeah, exactly. Even in a world of cyber warfare and artificial intelligence, sometimes the simplest tools still matter. So is Britain catching up to China in the pigeon gap? Have they created their own elite team of feathered spies?
Well, the answer is unfortunately not very clear. According to Gordon Carrera, he's a BBC security correspondent, and he loves pigeons. He says he's gotten assurances that they're looking into it.
Looking into it. Classic non-answer. Could mean anything. Or nothing. Maybe they're just trying to stall while they train their pigeon army.
Or maybe they've realized pigeons are old news and they're investing in something even weirder.
That's great.
What comes after pigeons, right? What technology haven't we even thought of that could be the next big spy tool?
Now that's something to think about. I mean, who would have guessed a few years ago that we'd be talking about pigeons as potential weapons of espionage?
It just goes to show that we need to stay curious, keep asking questions, and never underestimate the people who work in the shadows. And sometimes the most amazing stories are hiding in the most unexpected places.
Well, on that note, let's talk about the impact of espionage. Does all this cloak and dagger stuff actually matter in the grand scheme of things? Does it really shape history, or is it just a bunch of spy drama? So does all this cloak and dagger stuff, I mean, does it really matter? Does espionage actually shape history, or is it just, spy versus spy drama?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Historians, political scientists, they've been debating that for ages. And the answer is, well, it's complicated. Sometimes the impact of espionage is immediate, like a bomb going off, completely changing the course of history. But other times it's more like a slow erosion. It shapes how we see things, how decisions are made. Harder to see, but just as important.
Yeah, I can see that. Like Gordievsky, what he knew about the Soviet Union, that was critical during the Cold War.
Absolutely. He wasn't just sharing random gossip.
Yeah,
He was giving insights into like the core of Soviet thinking.
right. Right.
For instance, he revealed that the Soviets, they really believed the West was planning to launch a nuclear attack first.
Wow.
That's not just paranoia, that's a huge misunderstanding, the kind that could have led to, well, disaster.
So his information, it helped clear up those misunderstandings, maybe even prevented a conflict.
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely had a big impact on how the West dealt with negotiations and made policy decisions. Gordievsky's intelligence, it gave them a much better understanding of what the Soviets were thinking. And that helped them take a less aggressive approach, maybe even stop the Cold War from turning into an actual war.
That's a pretty clear example of espionage directly affecting history. But what about the more subtle cases? The ones that don't make the news?
Well, remember Kim Philby, the double agent we talked about?
Yeah.
His betrayal, it didn't lead to like an immediate war or anything like that, but the impact was huge, and it lasted a long time.
It's like that saying, one lie can ruin a whole truth. In Philby's case, one betrayal, it destroyed trust in British intelligence, like at its core.
Exactly. The damage wasn't just about secrets getting out or operations being compromised. It was about the loss of trust, the doubt it created within the intelligence community and among allies. That kind of damage, it takes years, even decades to fix.
It's like a poison, slowly spreading through the system and weakening it from the inside. Makes you think those ripple effects, those less obvious consequences of espionage, maybe they're actually more damaging in the long run.
That's a good point. I mean, think about it. When there's an immediate crisis, people often come together, they unite and become more determined. But it's those sneaky long-term consequences, the ones that erode trust and create suspicion, those can be much more damaging over time.
It reminds me of something I read in a John le Carré novel. The real enemy isn't always the one you're fighting. It's the doubt, the suspicion, the fear that grows within your own ranks.
That's a great way to put it. It really captures how insidious espionage can be. It's not just about stealing secrets, it's about sowing discord,
Mhm.
manipulating people's perceptions, and undermining trust. That's why it's so important to understand the history of espionage. It's not just about spies and missions, it's about understanding how these events have shaped our world, our institutions, even our own beliefs.
It's like studying a historical pandemic. Figuring out how a virus spread and changed helps us prepare better for the future.
Right, exactly. By studying the history of espionage, we can better understand the motives, the tactics, even the psychology of the people involved. And that knowledge, it can help us build stronger systems, predict threats, maybe even stop them before they happen. It's about learning from past mistakes so we don't repeat them. But it's easy to focus on the past and forget that espionage is still a very real concern today.
It is.
And it's not just about countries anymore. Think about it. Corporations, activist groups, even individuals. They have access to tools and techniques that used to be only for governments. The world of espionage is changing fast, and it's more important than ever to understand the threats, both the ones we see and the ones we don't.
It's like that line from The Dark Knight, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. The tools and tactics of espionage are changing, so what was once heroic might be seen as villainous in a different context.
That's a really interesting comparison. And it makes you think, as technology gets more advanced, as the lines between the real world and the digital world get blurrier, what will espionage look like in the future? Will we see those classic cloak and dagger operations come back, or will it be even more about manipulating information and perception?
And what about those pigeons? Will they still have a place in this new world of espionage, or will they just be a relic of the past? It really makes you realize that in the world of espionage, anything is possible.
It's a world where truth and lies are always tangled up, where things aren't always what they seem, and where the stakes are incredibly high.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the takeaway is pretty clear. Espionage matters. It shapes history, influences decisions, and makes us question everything we think we know. And as we move further into the 21st century, it's only going to become more relevant, more complicated, and more important to understand.
If you're interested in this kind of stuff, the shadowy world of spies and their impact on history, I'd really recommend checking out the Rest is Classified podcast. They cover all kinds of fascinating cases, from historical figures like Kim Philby to modern-day spies like Anna Chapman.
And who knows, maybe they'll even do an episode about the pigeon gap. We can always hope.
Until next time, stay curious, keep asking questions, and remember, sometimes the most incredible stories are hidden in the most unexpected places. And never underestimate the power of a well-placed pigeon.